British railways carried the war load. They met to the full the exacting demands made upon them by the United Nations at war. Railways entered the war at the peak of their efficiency. During the years before the war, they spent over £450 million on new works and improvements, a gigantic program resolutely carried through in the face of acute world depression in trade. Improvements were made to track, to signaling appliances, and to communications. Bigger and better engines were designed, locomotive depots were modernized and supplied with the most modern equipment. Turntables that work themselves, giant coaling plants that fill an engine tender in a few minutes. To the general public, the efficiency of the peacetime railway services was reflected in fast and frequent passenger journeys. But behind the scenes, the network of freight services was no less efficient. For the last 100 years, railway freight services have formed the backbone of Britain's trade and industry. In time of war, they are of supreme importance. Here again, improvements effected during the immediate post-war years enabled the railways, with their numerous depots and vast marshalling yards, to carry an ever-increasing load, munitions, guns and tanks, and to keep the factories that produce them supplied with fuel and raw materials. British railways were tuned for war. Evacuation of children from areas vulnerable to air bombardment was an important part of the national defense scheme. In 4 days, starting on September the 1st, 1939, 1,300,000 were moved from the big cities and towns. From the London area alone, 1,500 special trains were run, and when the flying bomb attack was launched on southern England, another exodus took place. So evacuation continued. From bombed towns, from countries overseas, from V-bombed London, the people were taken to the comparative safety of the English countryside. News paragraphs, official publications and books have been written about the day and night bombing of Britain by the ruthless German Air Force. But little has been told of the thousands of railwaymen for whom there was no imminent danger signal. Even when danger was overhead, the vital work of running the trains had to go on. Ton upon ton of high explosives and fire bombs rained down on Britain during the daylight blitz period, but railwaymen and women stuck to their posts and got the trains through. Day bombing proved too costly to the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain, and the switch over to night attacks by waves of German planes on our towns and cities was one which tested to the full the morale of the British public. Buildings were razed to the ground by landmines. Incendiaries by the thousands set fire to property. But a train couldn't dodge a plane or a bomb. It just had to stop or keep on. And keep on they did. Deeds of heroism by railwaymen and women were legion. Over 200 were decorated by the King for gallantry in air raids. Some 282 were killed and over 1,500 injured. The courage of these people in the midst of bombing was matched by the speed with which the engineers repaired broken and debris-littered tracks and quickly enabled services to be resumed. Traveling cranes were kept constantly under steam. Heavy timbers and other materials were held in readiness for immediate dispatch to repair damage to bridges. Generally, the most extensive bomb damage to the track was repaired within 12 hours. Undoubtedly, the skill of the engineers and the hard work of the gangs under their control was helped by the organization for dealing with damage set up before the war. Emergency breakdown trains and stocks of rails and other permanent way materials were located at strategic points. Gangs could be mobilized immediately, and arrangements existed for reinforcements to be drafted in from districts adjacent to the damage. The railway system of Britain withstood the worst that Germany could do. Even the most concentrated attacks failed to interfere seriously with traffic. The organization for repair was such that delays were reduced to a minimum, and the internal lines of communication so vital to the United Nations war effort were kept open. Sandwiched between the exacting transport requirements for direct war purposes, the ordinary supplies of fuel, food and merchandise to sustain the civilian life of the country had to be distributed by the railways. 1,250,000 freight wagons of all types were in constant service to meet these vast and growing needs. Fleets of specialized wagons, developed by the railways in peacetime and totaling some 50,000 vehicles, proved invaluable in moving the war traffics. Guns, shells, bombs and tanks got bigger and better. They presented new problems to the railways, who were called upon to move these awkward and cumbersome loads about the country. But the job was done. Many ingenious methods were devised to overcome transport problems. The total resources of the vast organization of British railways in both staff and equipment were harnessed to the task of prosecuting total war. The tanks, the guns, the mines, the bombs, and the men who fight them, these typify to the public a nation at war. And indeed, the ever-increasing production of factories crowded the railway tracks with these vital cargoes. But these were only the spearhead of modern war. And behind the spearhead were the 1,001 items of stores necessary to sustain the forces in the field. In the days of peace, millions of workers and their families were transported to the holiday beaches around our coasts. In war, the holiday expresses are no more, and the trains, once filled with happy, carefree people, were engaged on taking the factory workers between their homes and their work. 1,000 extra trains a day were needed for this task alone. The output of the workers, the vast supply system of which the railways formed so essential a part, reached fruition in the weapons of war. They poured from the factories in an avalanche, and as soon as they were made, they were delivered by the railways to the depots and the ports, ready for use in the theaters of war. Were the tools, the tanks, the guns, and the ships, and these the men who used them, the sailors, the soldiers, and the airmen, in the hot arid desert, in the high altitudes of the upper air, and in every part of the seven seas. They fought wherever the fight took them, knowing that behind them was the organization of supply, which played such a vital part in paving the way to victory.